Mark Twain said too much of anything is bad, but too much of a good whiskey is barely enough. Whiskey fans are very loyal. But what comes to mind if I say whiskey drinker to you? If you are a true fan of James Bond, you know that the mixed drink he had the most often is scotch and soda. From the books, not the movies. Winston Churchill was a great fan of whiskey, but famous actors such as Clark Gable and George Clooney love it too. So, is the whiskey drinker the strong, sophisticated, worldly type you think of? Or is it a John Wayne cowboy type of character who strolls up to the bar and says, "Give me the strongest thing you got"? Either way, drinking whiskey seems to say, I'm a real man. This was one of the reasons I shied away from it for years. I thought it would be too strong for me or just not appropriate. But I was completely missing out on some incredible flavors, textures, and taste sensations. It was actually after I found my appreciation for wine that I started looking into whiskey. It sounds bizarre, I know, but just as with wine, whiskey's intricate and many layers of flavors and complexities are fascinating. There's discovery in every glass. In today's lecture, we'll be tasting and demonstrating the following whiskeys: single malt Scotch, preferably peated, Irish whiskey, bourbon, rye whiskey, the Macallan Sherry Oak, and the Macallan Fine Oak. You may want to get these to taste along with me, or invite a few friends over to contribute a bottle and bring your costs down, or have an excuse to get together. Even if you just have one of these, your viewing will be much more interactive and fun. Our mixologist for the lecture will be Owen Thompson. In this lecture, we will make 3 cocktails, 2 classic recipes, a mint julep and a Manhattan, and then one that's hot, an Irish coffee. If you want to make these with us, make sure you get the list of ingredients from the recipe section of your guidebook. When I first started tasting spirits, the alcoholic strength was a bit too much for me. Perhaps you're like this too. That's okay. Here are a few tricks that will enable you to participate and still learn a lot. Smell your hands. As I mentioned in the last lecture, you can actually take a drop of spirit, rub it in your hands, and then smell your hands. It's actually amazing how many aromas that you can get just by smelling your hands. Don't laugh. This was a technique I used when I was first learning. Adding water can reduce the alcohol burn in your nose when smelling spirits, and whiskey fans know that even a drop of water can amplify the aromas. Don't believe me? Try this test. Take 2 old-fashioned glasses and put the same amount of whiskey in each. Then add a few drops of water to one, and then smell each. You really want to go back and forth between the 2. Do you notice the difference? The water reduces the impression of the alcohol, which allows some of the other aromas to shine through. If you distill wine and age it in oak, you get brandy, which we'll talk about later in the series. Whiskey is distilled beer aged in oak. This explanation hardly does either justice, but it's a simplification that can help you understand both at their core. Distillation was brought from Africa to Europe by the Moors. Between 1100 and 1300 AD, distillation spread in Ireland and Scotland through monastic distilleries. The Moors used this technique to make perfumes, but the monks used it largely for medicinal purposes, such as the treatment for colic, palsy, and smallpox. It's no accident that the southern belt of Europe produced spirits based on grapes and fruit, while those in the northern belt based their spirits on grain. Since the Northern Isles had few grapes from which to make wine, barley beer was used instead. I lived in the United Kingdom for a little while. It's cool, it's gray, it's damp, most of the time. And I've always thought of whiskey as liquid sunshine for the British. Scotland and Ireland were the first producers of whiskey, so let's start there and then we'll look at some other whiskeys from elsewhere around the world. In many ways, brandy production is easier to understand. If you take grapes, you crush them, and add yeast, you get wine, which you can distill. You can't do that with grain. You need more steps, such as malting, milling, and mashing. Let's look at malting, the first step in whiskey. Malting is the process of changing the starch of barley into fermentable sugar. Malting barley releases enzymes that help the process. The first step is to soak the barley in water for about 48 hours. This triggers the germination process. The grains are then laid in large drums where the air is cool and humid. In about 5 days, the barley begins to sprout, and at that point, the grain is called a green malt. Only a handful of distilleries malt on site. Most use commercial malting facilities. But after the barley becomes green malt, it's necessary to stop any more green plant growth because the whole point is to get fermentable sugar, not to sprout new barley plants. To kill the new growth, yet keep the fermentable sugars, the green malt is heated above kilns. A fire is lit in the kiln and the grain is held above on perforated floors. How the kilns are heated has a significant impact on flavor. Some kilns are fueled by coal, but others are by peat. Peat is a semi-carbonized, partially decayed vegetation that comes from bogs, moors, and swamp forests. If the kiln includes peat, the smoke from its fire infuses the barley with intense flavors of smoke and toast and sometimes kind of a vegetal briny note. This adds layers of flavors or complexity to the resulting spirit. This is where many whiskey producers differ, particularly in Scotland and Ireland. To peat or not to peat, that is the question. So who does and who doesn't? To use a sweeping generality, we can say that Scotch has peat and Irish whiskey does not. Products from the islands of Islay are typically peated. However, not all producers in Scotland use peat. And I can think of one producer in Ireland that does use peat. Here we have a peated Scotch whiskey and an unpeated Irish whiskey, Jameson whiskey. Smell and taste the unpeated first. And then smell and taste the peated one. What do you think? You probably noticed that the peated whiskey smells smokier, toasty, spicy, and more intense. The peated whiskeys always remind me of sitting fireside and smelling like the wonderful aromas you get that the fire gives off. Besides, the whiskey itself is nice and warming on the inside. Adding these layers of complexity is one of the benefits of peating. The more peat added to the fire, the more intense the peaty flavors. If you see the word malt on the bottle, as in single malt whiskey, it means the whiskey is made with 100% malted barley. Not all of the whiskeys are made with barley, and not all of those with barley are malted. Producers of grain whiskies in Scotland and Ireland, as well as producers of bourbon, use only a small amount of malted barley and focus instead on other types of cereals or grains. It takes only a fraction of malted barley to create the enzymes to break down the starch into fermentable sugars. After the barley has been malted, that means soaked, germinated, and kilned, it's taken to a mill where mechanical rollers, hammers, and grinders break up and strip away that outer husk, that covering, from the barley, so that the distiller can get at those fermentable sugars. In grain whiskeys, the unmalted grains are put in a pressure cooker at high temperature to hydrolyze the starch. Have you ever boiled potatoes to get them soft and mushy? This is the same concept, and to get at those fermentable sugars. Once we have fermentable sugars in the grains, whether malted or not, the grains are then milled and ground into a rough flour. This flour, or grist, is placed into a mash tun, which is a tank or a vessel where it's mixed with hot water crushed into a mash. The water pulls the fermentable sugars into the solution. This new fermentable sugar water solution is called wort and is now placed into a fermenter called a washback. So why do we care about the process? It affects the flavor in the resulting whiskey. For example, with Scotch, if the distiller does this process quickly, it pulls the solids along into the washback for a cloudy wort, which results actually in a more malty flavor. Now we're ready to start fermentation. The wort is cooled and yeast is added. After 48 hours, the liquid is about 7 to 10% alcohol by volume. It's no longer a wort, but now considered a wash. The speed of mashing affects flavor, but so does the length of fermentation. A short ferment, meaning less than 50 hours, with a cloudy wort gives a more malty kind of flavor. In a longer ferment, chemical reactions take place such as autolysis, and more congeners are created for more layers of flavors and complexity. Finally, the wash is ready to be distilled. At home, you can see how distillation works. Take a teapot of water and heat the water until it's boiling. As the steam comes out of the spot, cover it with the pot lid. Notice how the vapor collects and condenses on the underside of the lid. And congratulations! You've just distilled water. Distillation of alcohol works by the same concept, although alcohol actually boils before water. It has a lower boiling point temperature. Aroma molecules are more chemically similar than they are to alcohol than they are to water. So through the process of distillation, the aroma molecules tend to cling to the alcohol molecules. When a low wine or wash is heated, the alcohol molecules vaporize first. Clinging to them are these aroma flavor molecules that condense and then get captured. Pot stills are generally used for single malt whiskeys, while column stills are used for grain whiskeys. Let's take a quick look at each, starting with pot stills. The wash is first poured into the pot still. At this stage, it's called a wash still because it holds the low wine or wash. The pot vessel is heated over a fire. The fire sends the alcohol steam up into what's called the swan's neck. The vapors go into a water-cooled condenser where they condense into a liquid. The low spirit is then sent back into a pot still, this one called a spirit still, to undergo the same process. The spirit is then placed into waiting containers or directly into oak barrels. The pot still requires more labor because it's a batch system, meaning that to get the spirit to a high enough alcohol strength, it has to go through the system a few times. However, this process generally collects more congeners and complex flavors than column stills, which require only one run through the system. Column stills use steam versus a pot over a fire to separate alcohol from the wash and produce a high-strength spirit. And as opposed to the batch system used with the pot still, the column still is loaded only once to get that alcoholic strength. Scottish and Irish grain whiskies are generally made in column stills, and vodka and rum and gin are also made in this type of still. Scotch grain whiskies are mainly from maize, but use other grains as well. Whichever kind of still you use, you end up with a clear liquor called aquavitae, or water of life, which is then put in barrels. These oak casks give whiskey not only its color, but up to 70% of its flavor. The origin, type, and length of time in barrels significantly affects the type of flavor. The Macallan has a line of scotches aged in sherry oak that is called, not surprisingly, the sherry oak line. What this means is that before the oak barrels came to the distiller, they were filled with sherry from Spain. These sherry oak casks are made from European oak, which has a higher tannin level and provides a range of flavors such as dried fruit, spice like Christmas spices, clove, nutmeg, and sometimes known as chocolate and orange peel notes. The Macallan also has a fine oak range, which includes some American oak barrels that previously held bourbon. Bourbon barrels made from American oak provide notes of vanilla, a slight coconut, and some say like delicate citrus, apple, and floral notes. We can use our 4 S's, see, sniff, sip, and savor to compare these two scotches. First, let's see our first S. Pick up the sherry oak scotch and put it against a white surface to take note of the color. Look at the light tawny kind of color here. Now pick up the fine oak. Notice it's a bit lighter in color. That's not by accident. Now what I want you to do is sniff both of them side by side. First the sherry oak, and you get some of those notes of dried orange peels, but you also get some kind of caramel notes and some toffee notes. And the fine oak is a bit lighter and more delicate in its aromas, and it's a little more floral. Now let's taste them. Roll it around on your palate. And now the fine oak. You're going to notice that the fine oak actually has a more delicate structure on the palate, while the sherry oak is a bit more round and has a bit more body to it. Some producers do what's called finishing their scotches, but this doesn't mean that they're not complete. To finish a scotch means that after the spirit is aged in one set of barrels, it's then placed into a different set that previously held something else, wine, rum, sherry, port, sauterne, and so on. Each one infuses the whiskey with more layers of flavors that was in the barrel held previously. The length of time in barrel affects flavor just as much. The longer the whiskey is in the barrel, the deeper the color, the richer and more concentrated the whiskey, and the more notes it has of caramel and spice, meaning at that end of the spectrum. Because oak is a porous material, the liquid inside it is subject to evaporation. This concentrates the flavors, but it also reduces the amount of alcohol. You can tell from the bottle how long whiskey's been aged. In order to be called Scotch, it must age for at least 3 years in oak, but the number on the bottle is the age of the youngest Scotch in the blend. If the label says 18 years, that's not the average age of the blend, it's the age of the youngest Scotch in the blend. Once the whiskey is aged to the desired point, it's blended and bottled. The spirit is reduced with demineralized water to get it to the bottling strength, at least 40% alcohol by volume. But you may see the term cask strength. This means that the Scotch was not diluted and is usually about 50 to 60% alcohol by volume. Whiskies are then chill filtered to stop potential clouding at low temperatures, and caramel coloring is allowed to standardize color. But you should know that most premium and single malt Scotches are not chill filtered and don't have any added caramel color. But you can tell a lot from the label besides age. I already mentioned that single malt whiskey is made from malted barley from one distillery. There's also blended malt, made from a blend of malt whiskeys from more than one distillery. If you see blended grain on the label, it's grain whiskey, wheat or corn, with usually only about 10% malted barley. That comes from more than one distillery. If you see the words single grain, you have grain whiskey coming from one distillery. Scotland's whiskey producing areas are split into 4 main regions: the Highlands, the Lowlands, Speyside, and Islay or island whiskies. Each of the whiskies produced in these regions has its own character stemming from cultural, historical, geographical, and commercial factors, not directly from the impact of the soil or the climate or what's called terroir by the French. The largest geographic area is the Highlands, and its whiskey has the widest range of characteristics, including malty, sweet, grassy, heavy, and fruity. Most lowland Scotches go into the blends, and there aren't many distilleries left in that region. But these Scotches tend to be light and gentle without any of those peaty or briny characteristics that we see in many island malts. Speyside has the highest concentration of malt distilleries, which fall into one of 2 camps: the light, the fragrant, and the floral, such as Glenlivet or Glenfiddich, and the richer, fruitier examples, such as the Macallan and Balvenie. Finally, we have Islay and the island Scotches. This is the region where peated whiskey is famous. Historically, these islands didn't have any coal, so distillers used the fuel source that they had on hand: peat. Some of the Scotches from Islay are unpeated, but many are peated, and some heavily so, which gives the area's Scotch its famous, smoky, peaty, and briny taste. Scotland has about 100 distilleries. Ireland, on the other hand, has 3: Bushmills, Cooley, and Middleton. Ireland may have fewer distilleries than Scotland, but the Irish were the first to distill whiskey. You see both pot and column stills in Ireland, and Middleton, where Jameson whiskey is made, has both. Except for Bushmills, which uses exclusively malted barley in its single malt whiskies, the Irish signature is the use of unmalted barley, which makes the backbone of Irish blends. Let's use our 4 S's again to compare 2 whiskies: Highland Park and Jameson Irish whiskey. We've taken note of the color, but now let's sniff and taste. Gonna smell and taste the Irish whiskey. You can see what they're talking about. It has kind of a fruity kind of note, and it has a little bit of an oily texture, and you're getting a little bit of spice, but you can also tell you're getting that flavor of grain, that unmalted barley. And now let's taste the Highland Park. Even just in the nose, the aromas of the peatiness really comes through, and you're getting some of that element of malt. And on the palate, this is very spicy because you've got the peatiness there, and it's a bit more robust on the palate. Now on to North America. Early immigrants from Scotland and Ireland came to North America and brought with them their love of whiskey. This became popular very, very quickly. By the time George Washington died, he had 5 working stills at Mount Vernon and manufactured 11,000 gallons of rye whiskey. By 1791, it's estimated there was 1 whiskey still for every 6 people in America, including children. And in some areas, whiskey was used as currency. Even clergymen were paid in whiskey. Depending on where they settled, immigrants used what they could for the base material. So in Maryland and Pennsylvania, they used rye. In Kentucky, they used corn. And even today, bourbon must be at least 51% corn. Bourbon must be aged in new, charred American oak barrels. American oak has a high level of color and flavor compounds such as vanillin and lactones, which give the spirit its more reddish hue and more notes of vanilla, coconut, pine, chocolate, tobacco, and sometimes some people say cherry notes. Unlike what we saw in Scottish grain whiskies, no color additives are allowed in the production of bourbon. Nowadays, most bourbons and Tennessee whiskeys for that matter are first distilled in single column stills called beer stills. These stills are made of copper or stainless steel with copper-packed certain plates. The wash from such a still isn't high enough in alcohol to barrel age, so it's put in a pot still called a doubler for a second distillation to increase the alcohol and remove impurities. Tennessee whiskey conforms to the same regulations as bourbon, except that corn isn't required to be the dominant grain. It usually is, though, and Tennessee producers could call their products bourbon if they wanted to, but they don't. The very first American whiskeys were made from rye. To be classified as a rye whiskey, the mash bill, that is, grain recipe, must be a minimum of 51% rye. Rye is distilled in basically the same process as bourbon. So what difference does all of this make to taste? Let's do our 4 S's. Here we have Scotch, and we have bourbon. Smell the Scotch, and you're smelling some of that peatiness again. And smell the bourbon. The bourbon smells like, it smells kind of sweet. It has this impression of sweetness to it because that's from the corn that you have in it. Now, some bourbons have some rye in it, but Maker's Mark doesn't have any rye in it, so you're not getting some of that rye character, but you are getting some of the vanilla and those lactones that are coming from the oak, from the American oak, and let's taste them. You're tasting some of that malted barley with the Scotch. And with the bourbon, actually it's got a really bright attack. You've got a lot of that kind of vanilla character. You're getting that sweet impression of that corn. You're getting a little bit of a coconut kind of character as well. And you're getting some spice towards the finish. Now, let's taste the rye whiskey and compare it to the bourbon. Like I said, Maker's Mark doesn't have any rye in it, so it's actually a good one to compare and contrast to. So smell the bourbon, and then smell the rye whiskey. You're going to notice rye has its own unique, spicy, aromatic lift, and it's kind of almost lemon-scented. So let's taste the rye whiskey. On the palate, you're going to notice it tastes a little bit lighter, but it can be quite intense and have an acidic, slightly oily bite to it. Whiskeys are used in all kinds of cocktail categories, such as sours, juleps, toddies, smashes, nogs, and punches. Here we have a few classics made by our award-winning mixologist, Owen Thompson. He'll be making a mint julep, a Manhattan, and an Irish coffee.
I'll be making you a classic mint julep. We are fortunate enough here at American East Tavern to have these nice little julep tins. You could use a highball glass at home just fine. We're gonna take our fresh picked mint leaves, throw it down in the bottom of the glass here. Now I like to use just the back of a bar spoon just to sort of break up the mint, not really beat it up too bad, just releases the nice aromatics. We're gonna take that. We're gonna top this off with crushed ice. Crushed ice is key here. And the way we make our crushed ice here at American Eats Tavern, is we use these little hand crank ice crushers, sort of retro style. We found that it really provides the best quality of ice. Now, if you don't have one of these fancy little things at home, you could just sort of use a linen or a bag and beat it up with a hammer, take out a little bit of your aggression, get ready for your drink. Then you're good to go. So we're gonna take this crushed ice, we're gonna cover it up, our lovely pressed mint. Then we're gonna add about a ½ ounce of our simple syrup here. And a good solid 2½ ounces of our bourbon whiskey. This is definitely a bourbon lover's drink. All right, top it off with a little bit more crushed ice. Gonna throw a nice little straw in there. And just again for those aromatics, a nice big sprig of fresh mint. And there you go, our mint julep. All right, now we're gonna make our classic Manhattan. So to make our Manhattan, we're gonna start out with the bitters. A couple good dashes there. Then we're gonna throw in an ounce of sweet vermouth. You can dial that down a bit depending on how you like it. You can also do a perfect Manhattan, mixing it with a little bit of sweet, a little bit of dry vermouth, or you can do a full-on dry vermouth. It's all sort of how you like it. This is a very customizable drink. And then we're gonna do our bourbon whiskey here. Get 2 ounces of that. And we're gonna fill that up with ice. In this drink, we're gonna stir. Take your bar spoon, put it in there. And the trick to stirring is you wanna run the spoon around the outside of the glass. You don't really wanna agitate the ice. Depending on the kind of ice you have, you kind of feel out how long you gotta stir it. This, I'll stir about 25, 26 times. All right, we're gonna strain that into our nice chilled cocktail glass here. We keep ours in the fridge just to keep them at temperature all the time. If you could do that at home, or if you didn't have time, you could just throw a little bit of ice in the glass while you're mixing the drink. That'll make it nice and easy for you. And we're just gonna finish it up with one of our nice house cherries. And there you go, the Manhattan. Now we're gonna make a traditional Irish coffee. We're gonna do it the right way. The trick to an Irish coffee is we're gonna use a nice brown sugar here. Throw about a nice big tablespoon in there. We're gonna throw 1.5 ounces of our Irish whiskey. I'm gonna top that off with a little bit of black coffee. So the mistake a lot of people make with this, nowadays these drinks, they get served with like a cream liqueur or something like that. The traditional Irish coffee is just a blend of the black coffee, the Irish whiskey, a little bit of brown sugar for that richness. We're just gonna stir it real quick just to incorporate the sugar. And we're gonna top it off with a little bit of our freshly whipped cream. The trick to this whipped cream is that instead of that stuff you use in like a can, what we do is it's a really light whip. Because what you're going for is the difference in texture between the nice, light, cold whipped cream and the hot coffee with the whiskey. And there you go, you have the Irish coffee.
As you can imagine, there are a lot of variations with all of these drinks, so have fun experimenting. Next up, we're gonna go to the tropics to learn about rum. Instead of grain, rum's base is sugarcane. Rum has a fascinating history and is used to make a wide variety of versatile cocktails. For this lecture, you may want to have handy the following: rum agricole, which is based on sugarcane juice, white rum, preferably one based on molasses, gold rum, here I have one from Barbados, a dark rum or sipping rum, a Jamaican rum, and finally a spiced rum or a navy rum. So until then, cheers.